Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon to talk about spring wildflowers. This is presented by the Florida Wildflower Foundation. I'm Lisa Roberts, the Executive Director of the Foundation, and I welcome you. Thanks for joining us today. In case you're new to us, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitats throughout the state through education, research, planting, and conservation programs. You can learn more about Florida's native wildflowers on our website, www.flawildflowers.org. And this is brought to you by the State Wildflower License Plate, and whether you have this old look or the new one, you are helping to fund research, education, and planting projects statewide. So a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. You all will remain muted with your cameras off throughout the webinar. And we are recording this webinar, and it will be available about 24 hours from now on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/FLA-wildflowers. And you can also find it on our website, flawildflowers.org. You can submit questions using the Q&A feature at any point during the presentation, and we will be answering them at the end of the presentation as time permits. If your question doesn't get answered and you'd like to email it to us, we can forward it to Jeff Norcini at, just email us at info@flawildflowers.org. And finally, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Jeff Norcini is a private consultant through his firm, EcoHort. He heads up our research efforts, which include assessing native wildflower populations along roadsides throughout the state. He also is a consultant for the Florida Department of Transportation, where he provides assistance in all matters regarding native wildflowers and plants. Before establishing EcoHort, Jeff was a faculty member at the University of Florida's Research and Education Center in Quincy, Florida. He has a bachelor's degree in biology from Lock Haven University and a master's and PhD degrees in horticulture from Penn State. So welcome, Jeff. I'm going to let you take over if you would.
I'm unmuted. Okay.
Unmute.
And let me get my beginning. There we go. Oops, got to share the screen first. Screen two. Why is it not sharing? There we go. Okay. Looks good. Looks good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
all right. There we go. All right. I mean, as Lisa said, I'm going to be talking about spring wildflowers. Most of these occur throughout the state, with the exception of the Keys. And if it doesn't occur throughout the state, I'll let you know. But for the most part, many of these occur throughout the state of Florida. That first wildflower you see there on the slide there, that's lyre-leaf sage. That occurs in most parts of the state. It's flowering now, at least in this part of the state, and where I am in Tallahassee. Maybe it may also, it might. There we go. Better? Okay. You'll find this throughout most parts of the state, especially early in the spring.
Jeff, I hate to interrupt, but we're seeing a view of your presentation.
Okay. Okay, I got the wrong screen. Let me get the right screen. I thought I had the right screen. Okay, hold on. Let me share the right screen. How's that?
It's still the same. It's got the presenter notes.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Try it again. So I only have two options. Oh, screen two. There we go. How's that?
Much better.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So you heard me talk about lyre-leaf sage. And that's all I'm really going to talk about. It. I'm trying to focus on some other wildflowers that you see in the spring. This one's really common though. Very showy. First one I want to talk about after the lyre-leaf sage are the rain lilies. There's several species of rain lilies. You know, at least one of them will occur in your part of the state. This one happens to be Treats rain lily. And in mass, they're extremely showy. You tend to find these in moisture areas. I see them a lot in the medians of some roadsides, you know, at the bottom where it's moist, but they're hard to miss because they're extremely showy. And when they're in mass, they're even showier, but very showy wildflowers in the spring. These are true lilies. One that some people may consider a weed, I really love it, is the Heartwing Dock. It's named the Heartwing Dock because of the shape of its fruit. And in mass, it can really be spectacular. This is probably done now. This is more of an early spring wildflower. It's pretty much done here in the Panhandle. But further south, you're going to see this in February and March. But in mass, it's absolutely stunning. And this is really common on roadsides, or even in farmers' fields. You'll see it growing like this in just big masses, and puts on a really good show. A wildflower that puts on a good show, if it's in mass, if there's a lot of it, is this Canadian toadflax. You might even miss it if you're walking by it because these flowers are very small. Very common wildflower throughout most of the state, early to mid-spring, very showy if you look at it up close, and it's spectacular if you happen to find a field of it. This was in Central Florida, and I happened to be driving along a road on a rural roadside and saw this field of it. It's absolutely stunning when you can see a whole lot of it. And there, even there in the middle, there's some of the Heartwing Dock in there, but very showy. Two thistles I want to talk about. Thistles people either seem to love it or hate it, and that's because I think it's because it has a basal rosette of leaves that's extremely spiny. So some people don't like it because of that, but this is a really good plant for butterflies. Either of the thistles I'll be talking about, that happens to be a little skipper on it, but I see a lot of swallowtails on these thistles as well. This happens to be purple thistle, the Cirsium horridulum. And there's a sort of a pale yellow variant of this particular species, which I just learned about several years ago, but there's a pale yellow form of it as well. The other thistle I want to mention is the Nuttall's thistle. The flower tends to be a little bit smaller, but it attracts butterflies, the swallowtails, just as well as the other thistle. And as I said, it's just a little bit smaller. And this area looks a little bit different too. But they both are very showy and both are good at attracting butterflies. One that I'm particularly enamored with is the Fringed Bluestar. That's because it's one of the few native wildflowers that has true blue flowers. The flowers can anywhere be from a pale bluish color, almost a baby blue, and some of them are even white. This tends to occur mainly in drier areas. There is another species of Amsonia, but it's not quite as showy as this. And in mass, this is really showy when there's a whole bunch of it. It's beautiful. But basically, you're going to find this in dry areas. I see it beyond the back slopes on roadsides, in dry sandy areas, but very showy. The next wildflower is Ohio Spiderwort Tradescantia. This is an evergreen perennial. If it's not mowed back, it has daylily-like foliage. This only occurs as far south as Lake Okeechobee, though. So you're not going to see this in deep South Florida, but very showy flowers in the spring. And it tends to be in slightly moist soil. You're not going to find it in really dry soil. And the flowers are very showy. I have seen honeybees on this. I'm presuming other bees are attracted to this as well. But I've definitely seen honeybees on the spiderwort. And if you have it in your yard, it makes a nice green mass once it's done flowering. This has daylily-like foliage. There's two fleabanes I want to talk about that flower in the spring. One is the Oakleaf Fleabane. It has flowers that are either pure white or it can be anywhere to a pale pinkish purple. I'm not sure why the variation in color, but I've seen both colors out there. Very showy wildflower in mass, and I'll show you a picture of what it looks like when there's a whole, a large population of it. But it's sort of a dainty little daisy-like flower. And the Oakleaf Fleabane tends to occur in drier areas. You'll see it beyond the back slope on roadsides. The other fleabane is early whitetop fleabane, the Erigeron vernus meaning springtime. This one tends to occur in moister areas. So that's one way to help differentiate these two. The Oakleaf Fleabane tends to occur in dry areas. This one tends to occur in moister areas, and the flowers are only white on this one. By the way, there's only one non-native Erigeron or fleabane, and that occurs in extreme southeast Florida. So if you see a fleabane at this time of the year or even later in the year, it's probably a native one. And here's a difference in the foliage between the Oakleaf Fleabane and the early whitetop fleabane. And this Oakleaf Fleabane is appropriately named because the leaves do sort of look like oak leaves. And then you can see the difference down there on the lower right with the early whitetop fleabane, completely different foliage. But it's an easy way to differentiate those, especially the Oakleaf Fleabane is easy to pick out even before it flowers because of its distinct foliage. And this happens to be the early whitetop fleabane. And you can see how pretty it looks when there's a whole bunch of it. And the same with the Oakleaf Fleabane. And I've seen it out on I-10 where they're just, it is all over the place, like a white cloud there on the back slopes. It's very, very, very pretty. Now to Spanish needles or beggarticks. It's known by both of those common names. In the warmer parts of Florida, it's probably already starting to flower. It hasn't started flowering here in the Panhandle yet, but I imagine in Central and South Florida, it's flowering. It is ubiquitous. You'd be hard pressed not to find this in a disturbed area. It adapts very well to disturbed areas like roadsides or any other disturbed area. And I and other folks tend to have sort of a love-hate relationship, and I love it because it attracts it. Well, first of all, it's a very good nectar plant for the monarch as well as other butterflies. And in this picture here, you can see the butterflies there are the great southern white butterflies, and they were all over this when I was on A1A in Volusia County. They just absolutely love it. And when I have it growing in my front yard, there's always either a bee or a butterfly on it. It's a very good pollinator plant. So it's very attractive to bees and butterflies. It's a great plant to have. It adapts well to any site. It's a good plant for any place, if you don't mind the seeds. That's why I don't. That's the one negative about this are the seeds. And you can see here, these, it has two little awns here, and they're actually, if you look closer, they're barbed. So when you walk through a patch of this, you will come out covered with seeds. Wherever they dislodge very easily, and that they are a pain in the butt. And sometimes you don't realize you're walking into a patch of this till you walk out and you see your pants covered with seeds. But other than that, it's a great plant. And by the way, I just learned from DOT that they're going to remove this plant from its prohibited list because of its value to monarchs, the monarch butterfly. And as I mentioned before, this is a great pollinator plant for monarchs, and it's ubiquitous. Wood sorrel, the common yellow wood sorrel is you'll see this on the roadsides, but you'll see this in your yard as well. Very common. There's only 2 native wood sorrels. They're both yellow. This is the one that's most common, the yellow wood sorrel. And it's sort of, it will spread rapidly through your yard if you allow it, and it will take mowing, but it's very common. And as I said, there's only 2 native ones. They're both yellow. If you have a pink one, it is not native. It's very showy, but it's not native. And there's a couple pink varieties, excuse me, a couple pink species, pink flowering species. And I wanted to add this slide, the slide of this wood sorrel, just to point out that most of the flowers you see in the spring that are clover or have clover-like plant, or they're clover-like leaves, most of them are not native. If it's not one of the wood sorrels, it's unlikely that it's a native. It's unlikely that it's a native plant, because most of our clovers are not native. There are only 2 native clovers that occur in the state. You know, clovers or wildflowers with clover-like leaves. The only 2 native ones. There's 2 native clovers, the buffalo clover, which is Trifolium reflexum, and there's another one called Carolina clover, which is Trifolium carolinianum. The buffalo clover is very rare. I don't know if it's a listed species yet, but you'll only find it in the Panhandle, and it's very rare. So you're not likely to see it. The Carolina clover occurs in a good part of the state, but it's pretty nondescript. But if you see a clover or a clover-like plant and it's not a wood sorrel, it's probably not native. One that's one that's flowering right now is Black Medic, and it looks like it's just a little yellow clover. It's not native, and near Black Medic is one, and there's another non-native clover that has little yellow flowers, but that's not native either. So if it's not a wood sorrel, it's probably not native. Moving on to some common orchids that you can see on roadsides, and some of these, this particular one, the Ladiestresses may even pop up in your yard. There's several species of the Spiranthes. At least one of them occurs throughout, in your part of the state. And this is the typical form, foot and a half tall. And this is a typical form for the Ladiestresses. You only find it where it hasn't been mowed. So if your yard hasn't been mowed or a roadside hasn't been mowed, you might find these popping up. Sometimes it'll occur singly or just scattered about in an area. But they are native orchids. They're not super showy, but they're really interesting to look at. And like I said, if your yard is unmowed, you might find them popping up in your yard. Another native orchid are the Grasspinks. There's several species that occur throughout the state. These the best place to look for these is in rural areas where it's wet. And you'll notice here, give you an indication of the moisture. This is a little Whitetop Sedge, and that only occurs in moist areas. But these are very showy orchids. I've seen these on roadsides. You'll see them out in the wild. But only in wet areas, and most likely only in rural areas. I have seen these on the turnpike, sometimes in the Orlando area, but even further south. Once you get beyond the mow zone, they really stick out because they're very showy native orchids. There is one of these Grasspinks that does have white flowers, same shape but white flowers, but they are showy. And the other orchid I wanted to talk about, it's probably the showiest one that's relatively common, and one that's common on roadsides if the roadside has not been mowed. And fortunately, at least on the turnpike, Florida DOT knows where they occur and then holds off on mowing those areas until they die back. This happens to be in Hardy County in mid-May off of the state roadside. And you can see, here in the foreground and scattered about all through this area on this rural roadside. Very showy orchids. If you want them to spread, you have to hold off on mowing until they die back, once they will die back, late in the spring or early summer. But very showy orchids, these leafless beak orchids. they're easily a foot, foot and a half tall, and it's hard to miss these orangish red flowers. The one Coreopsis I want to talk about that occurs statewide is Leavenworth tick seed. This happens to be a shot in Levy County in the summertime. However, in Central and South Florida, I imagine they are already blooming. They're not blooming here in the northern part of the state yet, but they will bloom, at least in Central and South Florida, from the spring into the summer. It's more of a summer blooming plant in the Panhandle, but it's very showy wildflower. And this shot in Levy County, this just shows you what you can, what happens when mowing is reduced. The folks in I believe it's District 2 in Levy County, they just stop mowing and let this proliferate, and it can show you the benefits of reduced mowing. But very showy. This Coreopsis, the Leavenworth tick seed, for the most part, you're only going to find it in moist areas, in ditches and other moist areas, and it will even take inundation for up to a week. It spreads very easily by seed. So once you have it established, it will start spreading throughout. If you have it in a ditch, it'll start spreading, easily spreading, because the air are both windborne and they'll float on the water. So it spreads very easily in a ditch, or spreads easy to adjoining areas that are moist. One little interesting tidbit about tick seeds, and I've seen it on 3 different tick seed species, is this a little discoloration caused by thrips. The thrips are tiny little insects that feed by sucking. They poke into it and then suck some of the sap out, or some of the juices out of the flower petals. And you don't really see the thrips, but if you were to, cut off a flower, a peck of flower, and shake it upside down over a piece of white paper, you would start to see the tiny little thrips fall out. So they are in there. A lot of times they're hiding out here in the disc flowers, so you can shake them out. But it's just a little tidbit. So if you see this kind of damage on a Coreopsis, it's probably due to flower thrips. The next plant I want to talk about is Aletris lutea, the yellow Colicroot. It's the tall yellow plant here, growing amongst parrothead pitcher plants. Now, I'm not going to be talking about pitcher plants as far as carnivorous plants, but I am going to be talking about other carnivorous plants. And just an aside, if you want to see pitcher plants, the best place to see them is in North Florida, or especially the Apalachicola National Forest, where there's at least 5 species of pitcher plants. So if you want to see pitcher plants flowering, and they're flowering now in the spring, you want to go to the Panhandle, and especially the Apalachicola National Forest. But getting back to the Colicroot, it's a beautiful, tall yellow plant. You can't miss it. It's very showy, and it has these sandpapery type flowers to it. There's different species of Colicroot. There's a white one, there's another yellow one, but they all have this sandpapery type appearance to them. And I mentioned the pitcher plants, which are carnivorous plants. So I want to talk about 2 groups of carnivorous plants that you may not be familiar with. One of the groups is the butterworts. This particular one, yellow butterwort, occurs in most parts of the state. It is a carnivorous plant. Nice, very showy flower, not a very large flower. And there are other species. There's several species of butterworts in the state, but this is one that occurs in most parts of the state, is this Pinguicula lutea. And the flower is very pretty when you view it up close. And the insectivorous part of the plant are the leaves. This is these basal leaves, and the leaves themselves have a coating of insect trapping resin. So this is where they trap the insects, is down here. But the butterworts are very showy, especially in mass. Sometimes if you're lucky enough, you can see a whole group of them growing together in moist areas. Very showy, but yeah, and you're only going to see these in rural areas, or in a forest that's subjected to burning, those types of areas. this is not one you're going to see on the typical roadside, unless you're in a rural area and it's moist. The other group of carnivorous plants that I want to talk about are the bladderworts. There are 14 species of bladderworts in Florida. Most of them are yellow, and a lot of them occur throughout the state. You're going to find these in water, or you'll even find them growing in wet areas. The bladderworts, they trap small organisms in their tiny bladders, which have a trap door. And that trap door is triggered by hairs on that trap door, much like a Venus flytrap. And by the way, Venus flytrap you can find in Apalachicola National Forest, but it is not native to Florida. So I just want to point that out when I'm talking about carnivorous plants. Anyway, when the prey, whether it be a tiny insect, mosquito larvae, or a tiny little fly, it comes and touches that hair, that door opens in a fraction of a second and shuts in a fraction of a second. I mean, we're talking milliseconds. So it's extremely effective at capturing insects. So these are true insectivorous plants or carnivorous plants. Very interesting to look at. I was out kayaking a couple of weeks ago and saw these blooming, just standing. And most of the all the vegetative part on these is below the surface, and the only thing that sticks up is the flowers. But you can also find them growing in very wet areas. And if you're ever looking for bladderworts, be careful where you're walking, because areas are going to be wet to begin with. But you'll find them growing in standing water, or you'll find them growing here in mucky areas like this. And you can even see some growing in the background. But when you have a whole lot of them, they're very quite showy, very showy. And as I said, most of them are yellow. There are a few purple ones as well. The only purple ones that I'm familiar with, I've seen growing, they're aquatic species. They're growing only in standing water. And there's a close-up of the flower. Very showy flower. Another native spring blooming wildflower of wet areas is the pickerelweed. I can't say enough about it. It's just very showy when it's blooming in the spring and into early summer. It's very showy. This shot was in Central Florida. It's either State Route 40 or 44. And they only grow in shallow water. Even if that water dries up a little bit, they'll still be growing. But typically you find them growing in very shallow water. And right back here, these white flowers are American white water lilies. So I get more bang for our buck, but the pickerelweed is absolutely showy, very stunning in mass. Another plant, spring blooming wildflower of wet areas, is the butterweed. If you happen to venture in, you want to get a close up of this, the soil is, where these things grow, it's always wet, usually mucky. It's just a general aside, when you're looking at wildflowers, especially those that are growing in ditches or a little bit of water, be very careful. A lot of times that water is deeper than it looks. And sometimes that muck is deeper than it looks as well. I've learned the hard way by losing a shoe or two. So you've got to be careful when walking into ditches, looking at wildflowers, especially the wet ones. It may look like it's 6 inches deep, but maybe a foot deep, or that muck may just, may be difficult to move remove your shoes out of that muck. So just be careful when you're looking at wildflowers in these wet areas. This happens to be in Central Florida in Orange County in mid-April. Butterweeds are really showy. From a distance, it almost looks like a spring blooming goldenrod, but it's very showy plants, only in wet areas, either muck or even some, a little bit of, standing water. But only wet areas is where you're going to find these. I've even found these in retention basins, not the whole lot of them. Usually don't see one. Every once in a while you'll see one, but usually they occur in mass. And there's a close-up of the flower. And these tend to be early in the spring, more like April, sometimes early March into early to mid-April. Another plant of wet areas is the whitetop sedge. The showy part of this sedge are the bracts. They're the flowers in the middle, and this is the showy part. These are really common wildflowers. You're gonna, if there's only one or two, you may not notice them, but when they're in mass, they're hard to miss. Very showy in mass, and in moist to wet areas, even sometimes even standing water. And if you're lucky enough, you get to see a whole lot of them. This picture, this was a stunning display of the whitetop sedge. This was at rural county, and this was Dixie County on a rural roadside in May. There is another species that looks a lot like this, Rhynchospora latifolia, but its bracts are much larger than this, and it tends to flower later in the year. So if you see it in the spring, it's most likely this particular species. If you see it mid to late summer or even early fall, it's probably the other species, especially if it has very large bracts, which are easily twice the size of this, but very showy, especially in mass. I even have this growing at home in a little rain garden. It's this beautiful plant. Another species of that you're going to find only in moist areas, and one that I'm really fond of because it's a true blue wildflower, is the blue-eyed grass. Singly, they're not all that spectacular, but in mass, they're stunning. And I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. A couple interesting points about blue-eyed grass. First of all, it's not a grass. It's actually in the iris family, but it looks nothing like a typical iris. But it is true blue. There's a couple other species that have anywhere from a purple to a white flower. But this one is true blue, this particular species. Something interesting about this, about and here you see a shot there in Orange County. The blue-eyed grasses, at least this particular species, does not tend to open until mid to late morning. And then from what I've seen in the wild, they tend to shut up by mid-afternoon. So you have to go out there late morning, early afternoon if you want to see these in flower. On a cloudy day, they may stay open all day. They may not even open, because I've seen both cases out in the wild. Ones I have at home, they open up in mid-morning and then they stay open all day. So I don't know if this is an environmental factor. There may be something going on. There may be site differences. The different type of habitat may make a difference. I don't know, but the ones I have at home, which are these blue ones, they will actually stay open most of the day. But it's not unusual to see them close up, early to mid-afternoon. So if you want to see the blue-eyed grasses, go out late morning, early afternoon on a sunny day, and you'll see them. But they're absolutely stunning. And as I said, this was in Orange County, and there's a Leavenworth tick seed there growing with it. Sunshine Mimosa, great plant for a ground cover. You can use it on roads. You'll see it on roadsides. I have it in my yard. Absolutely stunning. It tends to bloom in mid to late spring with these powder puff-like flowers. It's a very aggressive ground cover. If you do happen to use it, it will spread very rapidly, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it is very showy. Its main blooms are in the mid to late, I'd say mid-spring, and maybe flowering already in Central Florida. It's not flowering here yet in North Florida, but very showy, no doubt about it. And the honeybees love it. I haven't seen any other bees on it, but I can tell you honeybees love this plant. And one interesting thing about this mimosa is that it is a legume, and it does have these nodules. These nodules contain bacteria that will convert the nitrogen gas in the atmosphere to ammonia that plants can use. So and that's called nitrogen fixation. You don't find these nodules all year round, but they are there, and they do help. Basically, these plants are self-fertilizing, at least with respect to nitrogen. Now, one interesting point, if you do happen to have this in your yard, it's very aggressive. I have it in my yard. I put it in there as a ground cover to hold down the weeds. But I have to trim it back every 4 to 6 weeks once it grows out over the curb. But it is aggressive. Don't use it if you don't want it to spread. It is a good substitute for turf if you want to use it as a substitute for turf. Where there's frost and freezes, it will die back. But it is it does come back every year from the roots. And very showy. Another showy plant is the coral bean. This is dry areas only. In North Florida, it's not flowering yet. It may be flowering already in Central and South Florida. Where there are no freezes or frosts, it will get up to about 6 feet tall. Here in the Panhandle, it dies back every year, so it only gets a few feet tall. But it's very showy. Will attract hummingbirds with these red flowers. And one thing you have to be careful, there are thorns. I don't know if these are thorns or spines, but they, regardless, it'll stick you. You have to be very careful with it. And it has these pods, and when the pods open up, it has these red seeds inside. However, these red seeds are poisonous. So you've got to be careful if where you're using it. If you have it in your yard, for example, you have to be careful because these seeds are poisonous. But it gives you, it extends the season of interest because you have the showy red flowers followed by these pods with the showy red fruit, showy red seeds. If you were trying to grow this, these are very hard seeded. You'd have to actually scarify them, use with a, sandpaper or a fingernail clipper or something like that to get these to germinate. But they are showy, no doubt about it. And moving on to spring blooming milkweeds. There's really 4 common milkweeds that occur here in Florida, but only 2 of them flower in the spring. One of them being the butterfly milkweed, which most of you are familiar with. This only occurs in dry areas, but very showy. This happens to be, looks like a Gulf fritillary on that. But the milkweeds in general, as most of you know, they are critical for the monarchs because they are the larval host plants for the monarch butterfly. This is what it looks like, the whole plant looks like. You can see it's growing in dry, sandy soil. And the other one that blooms in the spring is the Pinewoods milkweed. Oops, that got cut off. I apologize for that. That's Asclepias humistrata, the Pinewoods milkweed. Its range only extends down to, let me see here. Central Florida is at the southern end, at the southern edge of its range. It only goes down about, Orlando area, maybe a little bit further south, but not much further south than that. But showy milkweed, very important to the monarchs, especially here in the Panhandle. And it's easy to pick out on the roadsides. It only occurs in dry, sandy areas. And it's easy to pick out in the spring or even into early summer because of this purplish red foliage. It really does stick out. And then you can see some Florida green eyes to indicate that's also a native wildflower of dry, sandy areas in the sun. Now, if you happen to have this, if you happen to have either of the milkweeds or any of the milkweeds except Asclepias perennis, the swamp milkweed, growing in your yard, and you want to collect seed, the best way to do that, and this is something I did when I was doing a project for the Xerces Society, is put this little band around it. And that's so you don't lose these seeds because they will fly away once the suture opens. There's a little suture here. And once these seeds are ripe, that suture tears open. And I'll show you this on the next slide. Here's this suture. And when that opens up, these seed will expand. And the time to collect seed is before this suture is opened up very wide, because once it opens up like this, the seed with this very hairy pappus, they will fly away, and they're very hard to clean or separate. You get that pappus separated from the seed. Once they get to this state, when they're in the pod like this, you can open up that pod and just take these. These haven't expanded yet. They're very easy to take off, and you can get a lot of seed very quickly. But you have to get them just when the suture is opening, and you can see the seed are mature. So if you're collecting milkweed seed on your property, this is the way to do it. Do not collect milkweed seed off someone else's property without permission, and do not collect them off roadsides or any place else. you should only be collecting them off your property. And I want to wrap this up by talking about Gaillardia pachella, the blanket flower. As of early this year, this is no longer considered native. There were a couple papers put out, and most recently one back in late November, December, and it was concluded that Gaillardia pachella is no longer native to Florida. It's still a showy one, but it's not considered native anymore, unfortunately. And just to give you an idea, this just shows you the variation of flower colors. You can see the rose colored, and you can see the variation here on the amount of yellows and reds, but very showy, but no longer considered native. The only native blanket flower now in Florida is Gaillardia aestivalis, and it occurs north of Lake Okeechobee. Does not occur in South Florida, but Lake Okeechobee and north. It also occurs in dry, sandy areas, but not nearly as showy as a Gaillardia pachella, but it is native. And you can see not quite as floriferous either, but it does occur in dry, sandy soils. You won't see this. I've never seen it growing on a beach. I have seen it growing in the Tallahassee area on the back slopes and some dry, sandy sites. And just a little plug there. I've got my plate. I've got the new plate on my vehicle. There's the new plate. There's the old plate. And I'd be glad to take some questions.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. I always learn a lot when I'm watching your. But we've got a couple of questions, and first is that how do large populations of plants like whitetop sedge and Toadflax coreopsis, how do they become monocultures in their habitats?
That's a good question. I think they're just adapted to that situation. And the only place the most common places to see that are on roadsides that have reduced mowing. And I imagine they might occur in some other areas that are subjected to burns, but I think part of the reason is they're good colonizers, and good colonizers tend to occur in large populations. Although the blue-eyed grass is not as much of a colonizer, or the blue-eyed grass, I can tell you, will spread vegetatively. So that's one reason I think it may occur in large populations. The same thing with the whitetop sedge, that will also spread vegetatively. Neither of those are great seed producers, but they will spread vegetatively. And that may be one of the reasons why they tend to occur in larger colonies, is because they spread vegetatively.
Great. Question about blanket flower, the Gaillardia pachella. Where is it native, and where did it originate?
The most recent research says it's only native to the Southwest Texas, Southwest Texas. I'm not even convinced it's native. It's found in other parts of Texas, but I think it's mainly the southwestern part of Texas. Is from what I understand. It's the drier parts of Texas.
Okay. Another question about butterweed. Can you mention any pros of butterweed and how long they bloom? She's had a few pop up in her yard for the first time this spring.
Yeah, the butterweed, I think it will. I haven't. If you don't, once you definitely want to let it go to seed, so the seed spread. I don't know. The bottom growth may die back. I don't know that, but what I would already do, the only thing I would let it go until it sets seed. If you want to cut it back after it sets seed, that's fine. But I would just let it do its thing, and once it goes to seed, and don't cut it back before it goes to seed. It should spread because, or you can even, once that seed mature, you can take some of that seed and make sure you get it into the ditch where it's growing, or the wet area where it's growing, and just any area that would be moist, and we have moist ground, is take some of those seed and just sprinkle it on those areas and just sort of press that into the top layer of soil. But I would just let it go and see what happens, unless it does spread very easily.
Okay. Do you have any recommendations for where to see wildflowers in Pasco County?
Can you give me a town? or an area. If I was going to look, well, in general, when I'm looking for wildflowers, I go to rural areas, because that's the most likely area where you're going to find them, and especially where it's adjacent to a pine forest that's subjected to prescribed burning. But wet ditches are always a good area. Rural wet ditches is the best areas to find the wildflowers, or areas, any area in Pasco County where you've got a forest, a pine forest that's managed with burning. Those are going to be your best areas in general. I don't know where particular in Pasco County, but I would look in the rural areas and wet ditches and adjacent to pine forests.
Okay. Is the native wood sorrel and the native clover both have yellow flowers? How do you tell the difference between the two?
The buffalo clover has pink flowers. It's very rare. If you see buffalo clover and it's sort of a pinkish, it's not a real bright pink, but it's a pinkish flower. It blooms mainly in April, May, and the only place it occurs is in the Panhandle. But it's sort of got a pinkish flower, and then it once that flower sets seed, it dies back. It's very rare. If you see it, we definitely want to know where it occurs, because it's very uncommon. The wood sorrel is a yellow flower, but the buffalo clover is a typical. It's a typical clover type flower, like the white clover you see, although it's more of a pinkish, but it's very rare. You're not likely to find it on a roadside, I can tell you that. It would only be in a natural area. The only place that I know that it has occurred for sure is in the Apalachicola River Basin, just south of the Georgia border. That's one place where it's been found. I have not heard of it occurring anyplace else.
Okay. Somebody is noting that because of OE, we no longer recommend propagation of milkweed by the stalks. Do you think seed is the best propagation method, or do you have other ideas? She's in Southeast Florida.
Okay, the only species that I know because of OE is not propagating is the Asclepias curassavica, because that one tends to have higher loads of that OE. The other ones are okay as far as I know. Propagating milkweed is slow. They do take a long time to grow. No doubt about that, but you certainly can propagate it by seed. I don't know if that virus is, some viruses are transmitted via seed. I don't know if although this is not a virus, I don't know if the organism is transmitted by seed or not, but I tend to think it's not. But if you do it by seed, you're probably safe, but it's the Asclepias curassavica, the tropical milkweed. That's the one that's the major issue. If you have that, you definitely want to replace it with one of the native milkweeds, which aren't going to have the same load of that OE that the tropical milkweed is going to have.
Okay. Why are you looking for wildflowers on roadsides?
Pollinator. Bottom line. Well, first of all, there's a couple advantages to wildflowers on roadsides. Number one, they're great pollinator. They're great for pollinators. Second of all, where you find wildflowers that are in that, naturally occurring populations, or native plant community remnants or natural populations, if they're managed properly, you can actually reduce mowing where they occur. But those sites where these native plant community remnants occur, or the naturally occurring wildflowers occur, whether they're natural or naturalized, you want to make sure that weeds are not going to be an issue. Because in some of the areas, you may have some not nice wildflowers, but you may have some very competitive weeds that make the site unsightly, or you may have some invasive species, in which case you've got to take care of that invasive species, and that's going to wipe out your wildflowers. But the wildflowers have benefit for pollinators. You can reduce mowing, and they're showy. They have a lot of aesthetic appeal. That's why we're looking for them.
Okay. And is butterweed good for pollinators? And if so, which ones?
Anything with a daisy-like flower, it makes the nectar makes it easy for anything, like a butterfly or a bee to get on, to get the nectar on. So anything with a daisy-like flower, in my opinion, would be a good nectar plant. So I would say the butterfly weed, because it has that daisy-like flower, it is in the daisy family. I would think that, whatever pollinators are out there are certainly going to hit on it, whether it be the tiny little native bees or butterflies, but it has nectar that's very easy to get to.
Right. Will wood sorrel die back after blooming in the spring?
No, the leaves will be around, it'll be around until the frost.
Okay,
The soil sticks around and it will spread, no doubt about it. Yeah. And it can spread far and wide if you let it.
great. Just a couple more questions. Do you have any wildflower roots, driving roots to recommend?
Oh, yes, they're on the foundation website. And Lisa, I believe it's under research, is it not?
I think we have them posted on What's in Bloom.
What's in
Or What's
Bloom?
in Bloom.
Okay. Yes, there's two good. Yes, they're posted there. Those are good
Mhm.
wildflower site. Now the other one, if you're in the Panhandle, you want to go down State Route 65 in the Apalachicola National Forest. It's probably the best wildflower state. It's definitely the best wildflower or native wildflower site in the state. Maybe the lower south, starting at it's off of State Route 20, and at Telosia, and go south for 30 miles. Those wildflowers on both sides of the road. And that's mapped out, I believe. The foundation has that site mapped out.
Okay. And what's the prediction for this spring's wildflower show?
Things are early. Most things are early. Now, what I have noticed in the past is, even though some wildflowers may be blooming earlier than normal, there's some that bloom about the same time every year, regardless, of the weather, unless it's, some really severe droughts or excessive temperatures. Right now, I'm noticing a lot of plants are blooming early, but that doesn't mean everything will bloom early. But it's definitely, things are blooming earlier this year than normal. Now in South Florida, they just may only be a little bit earlier than normal. It really depends on the species. But a lot of stuff is blooming a little bit earlier than normal. We're meant to have a warm, dry spring, so that may slow down flowering of the normal, what you would see in the summer. So that may slow some of those down a little bit, or they may bloom right on time. But there's a lot of interaction there's interactions between the soil temperature, the air temperature, how much rain we get, how much sun we get. All those things it's a lot of factors that influence when a particular species will bloom.
Great. We have one last question, and it's a very good one. Is who can you call when you see wildflowers on roadsides being mowed down?
Well, if it's in a county, you call the county. If it's on a state roadside, you contact Florida DOT. In each district, Florida DOT has a wildflower coordinator, and that is on the DOT contacts. The wildflower contacts are on the Florida DOT website, which is being hosted by the foundation. So if you go to the foundation website and go to the Florida DOT website, there's a list of contacts. But contact Florida DOT if it's on a state roadside. You contact the county if it's on a county roadside.
Okay, great. Well, that's it. And thank you again, Jeff, for joining us. We learned so much about our spring wildflowers, and we're going to get out there and see them.
Thank you.